Hello, and welcome to Up and Running with ASP.NET 5. I'm Jess Chadwick, and I'll be guiding you through the latest version of Microsoft's web development platform, ASP.NET. ASP.NET 5 is a significant release for Microsoft, introducing a number of new concepts and completely revamping much of the existing parts of the framework. This version of the framework offers a more optimized developer experience, a better performing runtime, and even cross-platform support that will allow you to run your applications on Windows, Mac, or even Linux. Even if you've used previous versions of the framework, all of this may sound daunting, but don't worry. I've designed this course to show you everything you'll need to know in order to create and deploy professional quality ASP.NET 5 web applications. We've got a lot to cover, so if you're ready to get started, let's move right on to the next video, where I'll set some expectations about what you'll need to know first in order to get the most out of this course. In the previous video, I briefly introduced Microsoft's ASP.NET 5 framework and promised to show you everything you need to know in order to create and deploy ASP.NET 5 web applications. In making that promise, however, I'm working under the assumption that you've got some previous experience with both general web development concepts and the .NET framework. For example, in order to get the most out of this course, you should have a solid understanding of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS to the point where you'd be comfortable creating a web page from scratch for your personal website. You should also be familiar with the C# programming language and object-oriented development principles, enough that you wouldn't find it terribly challenging to create a .NET application displaying the current weather in your area using information that you retrieve from an online web API, for example. In other words, if you're a developer with decent familiarity with creating web pages and the .NET framework, then this course should be a great fit for you. On the other hand, if you're just starting out with either the .NET framework or web development in general, you'll probably want to build some comfort with those concepts before continuing with this course. No matter what your experience level with any of these topics, if at any point in this course you think you might want to brush up on something, we have some great courses here in the lynda.com online video training library that will help you do just that. For instance, if you need a refresher on HTML, CSS, or JavaScript, you may want to check out HTML Essential Training or JavaScript Essential Training. For more information on C# and the .NET framework, take a look at C# Essential Training or Up and Running with C#. Once you're ready to proceed, feel free to go on to the next video where I'll give you a quick overview of how to work with the code samples and other exercise files that we'll be referring to in this course. Since this is a course about software development, I'm going to be writing a lot of code. While I expect you to follow along by running the same code on your local machine, I don't necessarily expect you to have to type every character that I type. And I don't know about you, but whenever I'm having trouble running some sample code that I'm writing along with a training course, I always like to have a full working version of that code that I can refer to in order to help me figure out what I need to change in order to get my version of the code running. So to make that possible, I've captured a snapshot of the code that I show you at the end of every video, and it is available to you in two ways. Your first option is to download the exercise files as one big archive from the lynda.com website. Simply click on the Download Exercise Files button on the page you're currently on. This archive will contain a whole bunch of folders, one for each video in the course and each folder containing the full source code as it is at the end of that video. The top level folders are named for the chapter using the convention CHP_chapter number. And inside each of these chapter folders are folders for each of the videos following the convention of chapter number _ video number. The second option to get access to the source code is through my GitHub repository for this course. Since it contains a few dozen copies of the full source code, the archive file I mentioned in option 1 tends to be rather big. So if you're at all familiar with Git and the GitHub site, or if you're just looking to see the contents of one file, this is the option for you. Simply make a local clone of the repository and start looking through it. Note that this repository also contains snapshots at the end of each video, but rather than folders, I represent each one as a tag in the repository. That means if you want to see the code for a specific video, you can switch to that tag in your local repository or select that tab from the dropdown on the GitHub site. For instance, in order to see the source code for Chapter 3 Video 2, you can select this tag. On the GitHub site, This will change the context of the whole source code tree, and you can then use the website to browse through the code as it stands at the end of that video. Also note that you can download a zip archive of any tag as well by visiting the Releases tab and clicking on the zip link for that tag that you'd like to download. If you're familiar with the Get Source Control system, or are just interested in quickly looking at the contents of one or two files, I highly recommend the GitHub option number 2. However, if you're unfamiliar with Git or you prefer to have all of the source code for all of the videos downloaded once and available immediately, then feel free to download the exercise files directly from the lynda.com website. Either way, the full source code is there if you need it. I encourage you to refer to it as often as you need in order to get the most out of this course. In this course, I'm going to show you everything you need to know in order to build and deploy web applications with ASP.NET 5. And I'll start in this video by giving you a high-level overview of what exactly makes up an ASP.NET 5 application. Consider your deployed application as a bunch of layers, each one building on top of the other. All the way down at the bottom is the operating system, because of course you can't run any applications, web or otherwise, without an operating system. On top of the operating system sits the web server, also referred to as the web host or sometimes the web listener. This is the layer that accepts network requests routed by the operating system and passes the request off to an application framework. Many web servers have built-in functionalities such as content caching and the ability to serve static files without having to execute the application framework. Next up is the .NET Runtime itself. This is a very thin layer whose only job is to load .NET libraries, locate the entry point into the application, and execute it whenever a request is passed to it by the web server. These three components collectively provide the abstraction that hosts and executes application code, such that the application doesn't ever need to worry about the low-level details of handling requests and responses. In fact, consider there to be a line above this layer. Above that line is all of the code that defines the application. Below the line is all of the infrastructure required to host and execute the application. Infrastructure that the application never directly interacts with. The next layer in the stack, the first layer of the application, are the .NET libraries, written by Microsoft that provide the abstractions, data structures, and core implementations of things such as collections, files, and network I/O. Practically speaking, this layer contains the things that pretty much every application will need. On top of the .NET libraries sit the third-party libraries. By third-party here, I really just mean any library that was not written by your team or Microsoft. Much like the .NET libraries, these libraries provide reusable implementations of things that are commonly needed among applications, for instance, web diagnostics or JSON serialization libraries. In previous versions of the framework, these two layers were very distinctly different. The .NET runtime and libraries were installed centrally on the machine itself, and in order to leverage third-party libraries, you had to go and download them from the internet and include them right alongside your application. However, as I'll explain in detail throughout the course, in this version of ASP.NET, you now need to download and even include Microsoft's own .NET libraries alongside your application libraries in order to use them. So really the differentiation between these two layers is pretty thin. In fact, when it comes to any code above the line, you can just really consider it two layers, your code and other people's code. It's pretty much as simple as that. And finally, we have the application code layer at the top. This is the code that you are going to write that defines how your application should handle web requests. In other words, this is the code that makes your application your application. Now that I've explained the whole stack, let me jump back to the differentiation I made between the layers above and below that line. Perhaps the most significant difference between the two is that the layers above the line often reference each other. They're aware of each other. However, these layers rarely, if ever, directly reference the layers underneath them. In fact, for the most part, they don't even really know that they're there. The net result of this is that once the application is defined in the layers above the line, that application code can run on any compatible implementation of the layers below the line. For instance, version 5 of ASP.NET is being launched alongside a brand new version of the full .NET framework called .NET Core. .NET Core is a lightweight, fast, and modular version of the full .NET framework, fully rewritten from the ground up. I'll talk a little more about .NET Core in later videos, but what you need to know right now is that when it comes time to deploy your ASP.NET 5 application, you've got a choice between the full .NET framework or the new slimmed down .NET Core. Your application will work on either one. Perhaps more importantly than how lightweight the .NET Core framework is the fact that it's cross-platform, unlike the full .NET framework, which only runs on Windows. Likewise, previous versions of ASP.NET were pretty tightly coupled to both Windows and the IIS web server that comes with Windows. But ASP.NET 5 also takes full advantage of .NET Core's support for cross-platform compatibility. This opens up a whole new world of options and opportunities for developers, as the net result of all of that is that the developers can run their applications on pretty much any web server running on Windows, Mac, or Linux. Throughout the rest of this course, I'll be developing my code using Visual Studio on Windows and editing it in IIS Express, the lightweight version of IIS. However, rest assured that everything I show you in this course will also run just fine in any other configuration I'm showing here. And now that I've introduced you to the building blocks of an ASP.NET application, keep moving on to the next video, where I'll get into a little more detail about the differences between ASP.NET 5 and previous versions of the ASP.NET framework for those of you who have used ASP.NET in the past. If that doesn't apply to you, if this course is your first time learning and using ASP.NET, feel free to just skip this next video and jump right into the next chapter to start learning. In the previous video, I gave you a very high-level overview of the components that are involved in creating and running an ASP.NET 5 application. And that information is relevant to you regardless of whether you've been using the ASP.NET framework for years or just getting started with ASP.NET. However, it's important to note that version 5 of the ASP.NET framework has been completely rewritten from the ground up, and this means a lot has changed from previous versions. On the other hand, a lot has stayed very much the same as well. In this video, I'm going to run through a high-level comparison between ASP.NET 5 and previous versions of the ASP.NET framework, so that it's very clear what aspects of the previous versions carry over into this version, and which concepts are brand new to ASP.NET 5. So if you have been using the framework for a while and feel like you know it pretty well, this video is for you, as it will help you get the most out of this course by identifying the areas of the framework and the videos in this course that you're going to want to focus on, and which parts you can skim through since those areas of the framework haven't changed much. On the other hand, if you don't have much or any experience with previous versions of ASP.NET, then this video won't be much use to you, so you can probably just skip it and jump right into the next chapter to begin the course. As I mentioned in the beginning, the most important aspect of ASP.NET 5 is that it has been completely rewritten, which is a pretty significant undertaking no matter what the code base. Why did Microsoft take such a drastic approach? Well, here's a summary of all the improvements that have come as a result. In short, the ASP.NET framework is roughly 15 years old, and it accrued a lot of code and features over the years. Not to mention, the web development world has also changed a lot over those 15 years, meaning that some of the features that existed in the framework have grown obsolete or inefficient, and now there are new and better ways of developing web applications. Let's run through this list. Previous versions of the .NET framework were very tightly coupled to the Windows operating system, and previous versions of the ASP.NET framework were tightly coupled to the IIS web server running on Windows. However, recent years have seen an explosion in web servers, and IIS is not the only web hosting environment available. There are a number of lighter weight solutions that developers might like to take advantage of, including self-hosting or not requiring a dedicated web server at all. So rewriting the framework from the ground up takes care of many things all at once. Most importantly, it decouples the ASP.NET framework and the .NET framework as a whole from IIS and even Windows itself, allowing .NET developers to embrace other operating systems and web hosting environments such as Linux, or even the emerging technology of Docker containers. It also allows Microsoft to take a more modular approach, allowing developers to include only the parts of the framework that they need. A nice side effect of this modular approach is that Microsoft is able to simply not re-implement some features, enabling them to eliminate parts of the framework that may no longer be relevant or as efficient as they once were. In other words, Microsoft was able to write the next generation web application development framework while still making it look almost exactly like the framework that millions of developers are already familiar with. And just like the old framework, this new framework consists of two main parts: the ASP.NET Web Development Framework, and the core common framework that it runs on top of, .NET Core. You're already aware of what ASP.NET is, so what is .NET Core? .NET Core is a lightweight, cross-platform version of the full .NET framework that you've been used to using all of these years. In other words, all of the APIs that you know and love, such as the system.xml and system.io namespaces, are all still available, but they've been given a facelift. Some of their methods or method overloads may be missing, and some new cross-platform abstractions may have been introduced, but overall it's pretty much the same. Perhaps the biggest difference between the full .NET framework and the .NET Core is that .NET Core is not centrally installed on the machine, but rather copied locally with each application, and it sits right next to the other third-party libraries that applications may depend on, as well as the application code itself. In other words, when you deploy an ASP.NET 5 application, you're also deploying the parts of the .NET Core framework that it depends on as well. That means that it's possible for all of the various applications hosted on a single server to be running different versions of the .NET Core framework, and you can completely control when, or even if, individual applications get upgraded. This is the type of approach that is required for applications hosted in the cloud to remain truly isolated from one another. Since this course is specifically about building ASP.NET 5 applications, I will not be going very deep into the .NET Core framework. But the real reason I won't go into the details of the .NET Core framework in this course is because it simply doesn't matter. All of the ASP.NET 5 features I'll show and the code I'll write in this course will work great in either the core or the full versions of the .NET framework. The one significant way that this will impact you as a developer familiar with previous versions of ASP.NET is that in order to achieve cross-platform support, the entire system web namespace has been removed and replaced. That includes everything, all the way down to the fundamental interfaces such as HTTP modules and handlers. This reflects the fact that the request processing pipeline itself has changed. Rather than modules and handlers, we now have the new concept of a middleware pipeline, which I'll explain in the basics chapter. Also, the Web API framework classes are completely gone. It's all part of ASP.NET MVC now, but I'll get into that in later chapters too. Though this might sound shocking, it's really less earth-shattering than it seems. You see, the mindset that the Microsoft team stuck to when it implemented everything was something they called concept compatibility. For example, applications built with previous versions of ASP.NET may have depended heavily on the system.web.htp context class to gain access to things like the current request, the current user, or the response that was going to be returned. Well, ASP.NET 5 still has an HTTP context class, and that class even has properties such as request, response, and user. In other words, if you want to get the username for the current user, you're going to access the HTTP context.user.identity.name property to find it. It's just that none of those classes are going to be the same system.web classes that they used to be. And these new classes may not have implemented all of the methods and properties that you've used in some more advanced scenarios. Now, ASP.NET as a web development platform has always had a number of competitors. But in recent years, a few of them in particular, such as Ruby and Node, have really gained in popularity and adoption. One of the primary drivers for a developer when choosing a development platform is productivity. In other words, how quickly can he or she get that new feature into production? And modern web development has a lot of moving parts, not the least of which is a myriad open source client-side JavaScript frameworks available to choose from. What's more, modern web development often tends to involve a lot of incremental changes, requiring developers to switch back and forth between their IDE and reloading the browser to see the result quite a bit. Developers typically embrace anything that it can improve this workflow. Microsoft has attacked this on two fronts. The first is that ASP.NET applications don't require compilation. That is, they are compiled on the fly, and whenever a change is made to code that would have previously required a full recompilation of the entire app, the new dynamic compiler is smart enough to update only the parts of the compiled code that have changed, avoiding the need to recompile the entire application again. As a developer who's worked with ASP.NET in the past, I'm sure you can relate to how much time this can add up to over the course of a day. The only trade-off here is that if you've got a particularly large project, You may not get as many coffee breaks throughout the day, since those build times will now drop from minutes to seconds. The second way in which Visual Studio and ASP.NET have fully embraced modern web development is through full integration with popular web development tools such as NPM, Grunt, and Gulp, even going so far as to fully rely on client-side package management tools such as Bower as the way that you bring JavaScript libraries into your application. If you've ever looked at the build process of a Node.js application in Envy, then it's time to stop being so jealous. Now you can have the same exact process in your ASP.NET application. As you might expect, the addition of the .NET Core framework and the new way of handling client-side artifacts also changes the way in which you deploy and configure your applications. Though I'll cover the new deployment concerns in the last chapter. In the spirit of embracing evolving development practices and modern web development, Microsoft also introduces two new APIs that are at the core of the new runtime: configuration and dependency injection. The new configuration API does away with traditional .NET application configuration techniques such as web config, app config, and even machine config, and instead leaves it entirely up to the developer to explicitly import their own settings in whatever way they see fit. While that sounds rather open-ended, the configuration API also offers support for popular configuration techniques such as JSON and custom XML files, and even environment variables that are popular in the Linux world. And last but not least, Microsoft has built the new .NET Core and ASP.NET frameworks to support true dependency injection at every level in the application stack. That means that you have full control over which parts of the framework are included, up to and including the ability to configure them, wrap your own code around them, or even completely replace them if you like. Of course, the framework encourages you to apply dependency injection techniques to your own applications as well. If your team is already leveraging dependency injection with a particular inversion of control framework such as Autofactor and Inject, that's okay too. The new .NET Core dependency injection framework is completely pluggable, allowing you to replace Microsoft's implementation with any other implementation. And if you look, I'll bet that you'll find your favorite IOC container already has a version that's compatible with .NET Core. So everything I just explained is what's new and different in ASP.NET 5. Now let's talk about this course. I've made this course to be approachable by anyone with the basic knowledge of the .NET framework, which includes folks who've never used any version of ASP.NET prior to this one. That means that if you're already familiar with previous versions of ASP.NET and ASP.NET MVC, then you'll already know a bunch of the stuff I'm about to show you. If that describes you, then here's how to get the most out of this course. Even if you're an experienced developer, you're definitely going to want to watch at least the first few videos of the Basics chapter, where I outline the new idea of middleware and how to add references to external libraries. This will help you get acquainted with the process of working with the .NET Core libraries, as well as the new concept of the middleware pipeline that will be so crucial to understand going forward. I also encourage you to watch the last two videos of the Basics chapter, which introduce two new web development tools. But ASP.NET 5 does not require you to use these tools to build your application, so you can feel free to skip these chapters in the beginning and come back to them whenever you like. If you're already familiar with previous versions of ASP.NET MVC, then almost none of the code that I'll be showing in the ASP.NET MVC 6 chapter is going to be new to you. The major exception to that is the initial package installation and a few lines of configuration code that I'll show in the beginning of each video. If you find yourself not really learning anything new in each of these videos, feel free to skip on to the next video. There are two big exceptions to this though. ASP.NET MVC 6 has two brand new and powerful features called tag helpers and view components. So you're definitely going to want to check out the tag helpers video in the Working with Data chapter, as well as the Reusing Application Features with View Components video in the Maintainability and Reusability chapter. The same goes for the Web API chapter. Web API controllers and ASP.NET MVC controllers are now the same thing. And if you already know ASP.NET MVC, feel free to skip to the next video if you don't feel like you're seeing new APIs or concepts. If you're interested in the new configuration and dependency injection APIs and the new membership system, you're definitely going to want to check out the entire Maintainability and Reusability chapter and the videos on the new Identity Services API in the Security chapter. Not only are the concepts in these videos new to ASP.NET 5, they're also incredibly useful and powerful. And finally, the mechanics of deploying your application have changed a bit. So you're going to want to watch at least the first video of the deployment chapter, in which I give an overview of what you're going to need to know. Then you'll want to watch the IIS and Azure deployment videos, but only if you plan to deploy to those hosting environments. Now that I've given you a high-level overview of the differences between the previous versions of ASP.NET and the changes that ASP.NET 5 brings to the table, let's continue on with the rest of the course by moving on to the next video, where I'll expand upon all of these concepts and show you how to make the most of ASP.NET 5. In this chapter, I gave you a high-level introduction to the ASP.NET 5 framework and set some expectations on how to get the most out of this course. There is one detail that I left out, however. The videos that you're about to watch were created and recorded using a pre-release version of ASP.NET 5, Beta 4 to be exact. What's more, we're not going to see the final release version of the framework, known as the Release to Manufacturing or RTM version, until early in 2016. I know this because the ASP.NET team is nice enough to say so in the ASP.NET 5 roadmap, that they keep up to date on their GitHub repository, which you can access here. According to the roadmap, the team plans to release several more beta versions between now and the final RTM version in 2016. In other words, even though the code that I'll be showing in this course worked fine when I recorded the videos, by the time you watch this course, it'll already be out of date. This means that you will almost certainly run into situations where things don't work exactly as I described them. However, even though many of the details can and will change between the time of this recording and the final release of the framework, the concepts that I'll be showing, such as middleware, controllers, views, and web APIs, will almost certainly remain exactly the same. So don't be afraid to invest the time to learn the beta versions of the framework. It will be time well spent, just as long as you keep a few things in mind. First off, even though I'm about to tell you in the next video that all you need to install is Visual Studio 2015, during this pre-release stage, you will probably also be prompted to install additional versions of the .NET Runtime that support the version of the framework that you're using. For example, when opening up the exercise files for this course, you'll probably be prompted to install the Beta 4 version of the runtime. When this happens, go ahead and say yes to install the runtime. You may also need to install the updated web tools for Visual Studio. I use this link to download the tools. However, by the time you watch this, there will probably be a newer version of the tools, so it's probably best for you to do a Google search for Visual Studio Web Tools 2015 and install whatever comes up from Microsoft. Second, and perhaps most importantly, if you're going to follow along and write the code that I write in this course, pay very close attention to the version numbers that I use when I reference libraries in the project.json file. These version numbers indicate which beta version of the framework you're using. In all of the videos in this course, I will refer to library versions that end in -beta 4, which is the latest version of the framework as of the time of this recording. However, when you attempt to type the library names in, Visual Studio will give you the option to reference one of the later versions of these libraries, such as Beta 6 or Beta 7 or Beta 8. When this happens, always be sure to choose the Beta 4 version of the library, exactly as I do in the video. If you install these additional tools and pay close attention to these library versions, the code that I write in this course should work just fine, even though it is an older beta version. Once you've gotten through the whole course and learned how to build applications with the Beta 4 version of the framework, you'll inevitably run into another issue. Learning to write applications with the Beta 4 version of the framework is great, except for the fact that you'll probably also want to keep up with newer versions of the framework as they're released, even if they're not what I show in these videos. In fact, by the time this course is even published, Visual Studio will default to the Beta 6 release when I show you how to create a new project in the next chapter. Each new beta release will inevitably change something in the framework, which will mean that some of the code I show in these videos may not even work anymore. And obviously, I don't know what those changes are going to be to tell you what to look for right now. But the biggest problem is that it's not possible for me to re-record this entire course for each new beta release. Even still, I think it's a great idea for you to keep up with the latest versions of the framework as they come out. And in order to help you with that without re-recording the whole course, I'll be maintaining 2 sets of the exercise files that I introduced earlier in this chapter. The first set of exercise files will contain code written against the Beta 4 version of the framework. This code matches exactly what you will see me type in the videos throughout the course. The second set of exercise files will contain the same code that I write in this course, but I'll continue to update it with each new version of the ASP.NET 5 framework as it's released. That means that there will be a different set of exercise files for each beta release that comes out after this course is published. Also note that I will only be updating the final application in this updated set of files, so they will not be available on a video by video basis. This shouldn't be too much of a problem for you though, since the updated code should still contain the same file that you're having a problem with. Just as I mentioned in the Using Exercise Files video, both sets of exercise files will be available in 2 places. First, you'll be able to download them from the lynda.com website. Second, you'll also be able to view and download the files from the GitHub repository for this course located at this address. I'll keep the master branch of this repository up to date with the latest beta version, so if you choose to clone the repository, you'll be downloading the latest version. I'll also create a branch for each beta version as well, so that if I've updated the master branch to say beta 8 and you want to see the code for beta 6, simply select the beta 6 branch from the branch dropdown to go back in time and see the code that is compatible with that beta 6 release. In addition to fixing the code for each version, I will also update the README file that appears on the repository homepage, with release notes that describe exactly what changes I had to make when upgrading from beta version to beta version. So, when you run into a situation where the code that I tell you to write in one of these videos doesn't work for you using the latest version, you can always check the release notes and the updated source code to see how that code had to be changed. I know that dealing with pre-release code can be painful, but these 2 tools should help reduce the pain in learning what has changed between each new beta version that gets released. And rest assured that when the RTM version of ASP.NET 5 is finally released, I will not only be updating the exercise files, but also re-recording the entire course as quickly as possible. And once that's done, you won't have to deal with any of these issues again. So now that you know all of this, please feel free to continue on with the rest of the course, knowing that even if some things do change, you will be among the first folks in the world that are able to get up and running with ASP.NET 5.